Hi, and welcome back to Police Story Podcast. This is episode 19, and I'm Dave. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force. We've covered a few subjects, some of them reoccurring, and death is one of those. So this one is about death, although possibly a slightly more light-hearted story if you can have a light-hearted story about death. One of the things in the police, as we've discussed before, is you do have to be careful of how you deal with things. Internally, and mentally. I'm talking about. We hear lots about PTSD and cops suffering with issues and having to have counselling. All cops will have, throughout their career, whether it was 1 year or 30 years, will have you know, a handful of jobs that they remember particularly, and perhaps two or three that will really get them every time. And I'm exactly the same. This isn't one of those stories, although this one I do remember very well, just because it was slightly unusual again. In and around death, as we said before, new cops struggle with the concept. Invariably, they're pretty young, and have had no contact with death. Certainly as part of the sort of police banter and initiation. This perhaps doesn't go on so much now because we live in a slightly different world, but certainly in relation to, we talked about mortuaries I think a little bit last time, and post-mortems and things, and it's always a difficult one for the new guys and girls. Now, I'm not sure it's an urban legend or not. I've never seen it myself before, but it's certainly a story that's been passed down over the years. I've no doubt somebody somewhere has done this at some point, but um, you hear the story about the grizzled old PC who goes down to the mortuary uh, in the early hours of the morning when there's no staff about, and you've got a brand new probationer on your team. And the story goes, as I say, don't know if it's true or not, that said sort of old sweat cop takes off his socks, slides open one of the mortuary trays, and lays in the fridge, gets slid into the fridge with a green sheet over him and just his exposed feet that he's taken his socks off. And, they've tied a blank tag around his big toe, which is how the bodies are stored in the mortuary. And then lays in there while the new probationer and probably his or her tutor are brought in to be shown for the first time, the mortuary, to have a look around and, see um, the procedures and what the place looks like, and it takes away that sort of big deal for the first time when you go there, genuinely with your first body. So probationer walks in with the tutor, and the tutor says, well, here's the row of fridges, and you just pull the handles and then the bodies slide out, and of course they'll suggest, well, just have a go so you know how they work. Let's say this one here, which will be the one with the PC already lying in it with his green sheet on him, and then the probationer slides out the tray, and just the toes are exposed. And of course, at that point, the cop who's laying there underneath the sheet will wiggle his toes and say, "It's cold in here, isn't it, mate? Close the door again, would you?" Or something like that. And invariably, of course, the probationer absolutely freaks out, and and that's obviously the whole joke of it. Now, like I say, don't know whether it's true or not. Some people might think that's appalling, and yes, it probably is. But you have to remember, when you're dealing with stuff day in, day out, if you take it all too seriously, and I've said this before, you will be a basket case. There has to be elements of humor, perhaps is the wrong word, but some light-hearted moments, even in the darkest times, because that's how you get through it. Let's face it. So this story I'll tell you today is a little bit unusual, and yes, about death, but possibly a light-hearted version. So picture the scene. I'm with another colleague. I couldn't remember who the colleague was. Don't know if it was male or female, whether they had a lot of service or whatever, but there was two of us in the car, which was the norm at the time. Single crewing was unusual. It happens a lot now. And we get called out on our ground to a sudden death, which happens all the time, because police are informed of virtually all deaths, certainly within the home. Even if it's expected, there'll be an ambulance report just to let us know, and we may go along just very briefly to check details. If the person hasn't seen the doctor within a couple of weeks and the doctor's not willing to sign the death certificate, then there's every chance we will fill out a report, and there will be a basic report will go to either the Procurator Fiscal in Scotland or the coroner in England and Wales, because they will need to decide a cause of death. So in which case it will be a full sort of death report and an investigation. Um, Generally, if they've seen the doctor in a couple of weeks, and let's say they're dying of cancer or something, if doctor's happy to sign off the certificate, then that's the end of it. But it does shock people still, people that are already having a very bad time of it because their relative has just died when the police turn up on their door. Anyway, so yeah, call comes in, sudden death, and this sudden death is on a holiday caravan park. Now in the UK, and I'm sure other places in the world as well, there are lots of these, particularly on the coastal areas. There's a lot of these big caravan holiday parks, and they consist of row upon row of large static caravans. So these are the ones that are kind of 30 or 40 foot long and sleep sort of 6 people in 3 bedrooms. They're the fixed caravans, not the ones on wheels. They're sort of up on blocks and they're plumbed in and all that. They don't move. But they're good fun, these holidays. I've done quite a lot myself. They're great for kids because normally you have entertainment laid on at these places. As I say, very popular with kids. Quite often they're near beaches, so people go over to the beach, and there's swimming pools and kids parks, so they're great. And generally they're a bit cheaper as well. So they do attract a lot of people. Now some people or some parks allow residential people to stay there, i.e. you can live there full time. A lot of them don't like it, but it's a very cheap way of living, really. So certainly in these times of financial hardship and credit crunch, as we always seem to be in, excuse me, that's what had happened on this occasion. There was a guy that lived in this park that had died in this park, and we knew nothing more than that, really. And it was right out on the edge of our ground, right on the border with the sort of next force. So it was quite a long trek. So it was about an hour's drive under normal conditions. And obviously, you wouldn't blue light to something like that because, he's dead. You've had the death report, sort of verbally on the radio. You driving faster isn't going to bring him back. It's not like you're trying to save anyone. It's already gone past that. So out we go, and as we turn up at this holiday park, now I remember it was the height of summer, so it was kind of like mid-August or something. It was the busiest time for the caravan park there was. And when we drove onto the site, there's hundreds of kids everywhere on bikes and playing football and doing all the things that kids should do in the summer, running around and having a great time. But of course, a marked police car, a uniformed police car turning up was, the most exciting thing that had happened that day. So they were fascinated. And unfortunately, as we drove to the reception initially to find out where this caravan was, we had this sort of, we were like the Pied Piper. We had this trail of kids following us on their bikes and all the rest of it, with all the usual questions. What's going on, mister? What are you here for? Oh, you're going to arrest someone, can we watch? And all this sort of stuff. So you're just sort of, playing along to a degree, but obviously we don't want them around, bearing in mind what we're going to deal with. So we speak to the staff there, and they said that the guy was a resident on the park, and he'd lived there for some years, and they sort of saw him on and off. Somebody had gone to check on him because they'd not seen him for a while, and then some of the neighbouring caravans had complained about flies, around this caravan. So a member of staff had gone out to check, kind of knocked on the door, no reply, gone in and found him, deceased in his bedroom. Generally, the bedrooms and these things are kind of in the ends. So it seemed on the face of it quite straightforward. He was fairly young though. I think he was about 35 or something like that, maybe even 30. He really wasn't that old. So that was this sort of standout thing. And I said to the staff, because obviously they might know him, any ideas? Did he have like medical conditions or anything? And they just said to me, they didn't know for sure, but that he didn't leave the caravan much, and their sort of parting comment was he's quite a big lad. So I was like, okay, had in my mind, what big is. So we get directed, and of course some of these places literally have like 1,000 caravans on the site. So you normally get a map off the reception, and they say, they'll mark it with a pen, this is the one here you want to go to. It's a really confusing place to drive around. And all these hundreds and hundreds of vans. You're trying to follow the map, and you're trying to think which way up is it and all this. Anyway, eventually we found our way to this caravan, and it was the standout caravan because firstly it looked a little bit kind of grubbier than all the others. And secondly, even pulling up, to the van, we could see um, a substantial amount of flies, kind of buzzing around. Unfortunately, we were still the Pied Piper and we still had all these kids with us. So all the questions are coming out again, and we were like, oh no, we're just going to speak to someone, in this van, no problems. Why don't you go off, to see your friends or play somewhere else, and blah blah blah. Just generally trying to get them away without letting them know what was going on, because we knew it could be an issue. So at this point, we go in and we have a look. Now the caravan was, if it looked a bit grubby on the outside, on the inside it was something else. There was just stuff everywhere. I mean, it was horrendous. There was mold and dirt all over the inside. It absolutely stank, and not just the death smell, because that's very distinctive, and that's unfortunately something I know quite well. And again, as a cop, it's something you'll recognise very quickly. But just a general terrible smell of kind of dirt and something that's just not been cleaned forever. There was all sorts of clothes, dirty clothes all over the floor and things, and it was a real state in there. There was pans, dirty pans, and washing up piled up in the sink, that clearly hadn't been touched for months, because not only were they dirty, but they were full of mold, and all the flies were in them as well. So this place absolutely stank, and you've got to remember it was about 30 degrees, so it was boiling hot as well. And because all the windows and doors had been closed, um, it made it even worse. So not only was it, I dread to think what the temperature was in the actual caravan. It was 30 degrees outside, so you can imagine what it was like inside with all the doors and windows shut. Now, again, I'm not an expert on these things, but you wonder, well, how did the flies get in? If all the doors and windows are shut, how did they get in? But they do, and I think I read something somewhere. I'm sure you can Google it, but flies can smell death from like 3 miles away or something, and will flock to it, because what they're aiming to do is lay their eggs on the on the corpse, so that when they hatch into maggots, they've got something to eat. But which is it's the stuff of of horror films. Let's be honest. So yes, invariably flies would kind of follow you to any of these jobs. But yeah, this place was horrendous. The other thing we saw on the floor, and this is quite common, and at the time I didn't know why. I understand it a bit more now, and you will as we go through. But there was bottles and bottles of liquid, all littered all around the caravan, 2 litre bottles, and a lot of it was White Lightning, which in the UK is like a really really cheap cider that packs a punch. And quite often we find our sort of alcoholics will drink stuff like that because it's very cheap, but it's so strong that it kind of does the job. I'm sure in your area you'll know of the cheap alcohol that you know people people use for that purpose, and every country it seems have its own. So sort of down south it was I don't even know if they're still going to say White Lightning cider. Probably closer to petrol than cider. Absolutely horrendous stuff, very strong but very cheap, so people would buy it in bulk. And Scotland has the same. They have their various things that they talk about. There's one particularly that the locals will call Wreck the Hoose Juice, which is quite well known. And yeah, so there was all these empty, well, I say empty, there was all these bottles of liquid on the floor and spread around the main caravan. But almost certainly, and in fact we did discover that it was bottles of urine. So he'd use these bottles as wee bottles rather than the toilet. And as we passed the toilet compartment, that was the worst of all in terms of smell and appearance. And the door was already open, so as we walked past, I could see that the feces, I mean, no wonder he wasn't using the toilet, it was piled up like above the level of the toilet seat. It was horrendous. So, imagine this, all this smell going on. And unfortunately, the deceased guy in the next room as well, in 30 degrees heat with all these flies. Thankfully, this is a podcast and it hasn't got smell-o-vision, but trust me, if it had, those with delicate stomachs would be running for the sick bucket. So we continue on, and finally we get to the bedroom in this static caravan, which is, as I say, at the very far end of the caravan. Now, the doorways are quite small. They're almost like sort of on ships in that they were oval, so when you open the door, you had to kind of step over the lip of the door and also duck your head a bit to get in. It wasn't like a full-size door. And, I'm not massive, but especially with my body armor on and stuff, I had to kind of turn sideways to shuffle through that door. That's how narrow it was. So we open the door, and there before us is a double bed, and the bed is soiled beyond belief, not just with feces, but just all sorts of dirt and unpleasantness. The floor is littered even more with the empty bottles, and also stacked up in every corner was empty pizza boxes. I'm talking like there must have been 100 pizza boxes in there. And a little bit earlier, when I'd been speaking to the staff and I'd said to them, kind of, where is this place and do you know him and stuff, and they'd said about him, he doesn't really leave. They'd said then that he gets lots of pizzas delivered, and they come to him, but he just takes them through the window of his bedroom. And we could see why, when their comment about he was a big lad. The covers were pulled back, so he was naked in bed, but he was absolutely ginormous. I mean, he must have been 30 stone, I would think, and you'll have to check what that is in pounds for Americans and people that use pounds, but he was absolutely ginormous. And my instant thought was, how on earth are we going to get him out of here? Now, in other cases, I've heard of fire brigade being used to sort of manhandle people out, and I've even heard of cranes being used to take people out, very large people out of, windows and things. But I was thinking, it doesn't matter what you have, this guy isn't coming out anywhere because he just isn't going to fit. I couldn't get through the door sideways with body armor on, and this guy was like three of me laying beside each other wide, so instantly I could see a bit of an issue there. So once we kind of confirmed death initially, now at that point, cops were allowed to confirm death if it was so far gone. Now we think he'd been there a month or so. So it was very apparent, he was at an advanced state of sort of decomposition. So generally the control room, when you call up on your radio, will take that. If there's any sort of query, or if it's happened, literally within the last few days, if it's not obvious, then they may well send out an ambulance crew who can officially pronounce life extinct, and certainly that can be known as PLE, and you'll ask for what's the PLE time, because ambulance crew will come out and say time of death 15:43, you write down your form PLE 15:43, so they pronounce life extinct. But and I'm sure other places call it different things, but in this case, he was so far gone, it was very apparent, and the control room were happy that what we told them and sort of described to them. So the control room sergeant was sort of satisfied that it didn't need someone to come out and pronounce life. So the next stage is you say, well, can I have the undertakers then? So sometimes people have already sort of pre-arranged what undertakers they want, particularly if they're older, or they've got some sort of condition that they know is going to finish them off. They'll have already talked with this, but this guy, as I say, was about 35, so he definitely hadn't done that. So we have a duty undertaker that comes out, and it rotates around half a dozen local undertakers so that it's fair and there's no sort of preferential treatment for any of them. So a local undertaker was assigned, and they were heading out. So we were having to think of how are we going to do this, and I poked my head outside mainly to get some fresh air. And of course, all the kids were still outside, and it wasn't like they were all with their parents. So I could speak individually to the parents and say, look, could you just get the kids away from here while we just sort of move this guy? It's not going to be very pleasant, etc. It was, loads of kids, no parents in sight. And I know for a fact that had I said to the kids, right, kids, I want you all to go away, I want you all to go away from this van while we're doing something, all that would have done is they'd have probably gone and got their mates and come back. It would have been, that probably would have doubled the crowd instantly, because all the kids are like, ooh, what's going on, So I didn't do that. And I thought, well, we'll just have to try and be as subtle as we can. So the undertakers turned up, and unusually they were in a car. Now, normally they have a small van and it might say private ambulance on the side. That's the classic. So if you see stuff on the news, certainly in the UK, and there might have been a murder or something, and you see this private ambulance turn up, that invariably is the undertakers who are going to take the body away. And they turned up in a car. It was like a big Volvo estate, and it was blacked out in the back, but it wasn't that big. And again, I'm thinking, this guy is way bigger than your normal person. I don't even know if we're going to get him in the car, but I said to the guys that turned up, who thankfully were a couple of quite big lads themselves, I said, you have to see this guy, come and have a look at him first, because, and see, do you think he's genuinely going to go in your car? So they came in, and of course there was lots of sucking of teeth and oof, blimey, yeah, he's a big boy. I'm not sure. And I said, well, we need to be sure, because the last thing I'm going to do is take him out of here and then get him out into the fresh air with all these kids around to find that he doesn't fit in your car. Can you imagine it? I mean, it would be like something flipping off a comedy show. It'd be horrendous. So in the end, they said, well, look, we got, we could measure him and make sure we think he's going to go in. So that's what they did. So you're in this bizarre situation where you're in this, you know, terribly smelling caravan, surrounded by, quite frankly, bottles of piss and empty pizza boxes, and feces, stacked up in a toilet in 30 degrees heat. I'm sure you're getting the idea. But and they're measuring this guy. So, they measure his width and like, right, he's X amount. He's so wide, and then particularly his depth. Laying flat, how high he was, because that was going to be the issue. So. Anyway, it was decided he would go in the car, but it was going to be tight, But they said, no, we'll get him in. We're sure. We measured it, and he's going to fit. So like, right, okay, please let them have got that right. So we had to think about it, and the only thing we could decide that, thankfully, the bedroom in this caravan, the very far window was a big window, almost full width window, and it opened as one, hinged from the top, thankfully, so you could open it right out. Although it had a safety feature on it, I think, where it only opened about 2 feet or something, so that somebody perhaps couldn't fall out or whatever it was. So we ended up having to take some of the hinges off and actually remove the window, because the plan was the four of us would manhandle him. Now, he didn't fit in a body bag, he was just too big for it. So we ended up getting a sheet that we laid across him, and we slid him onto the, with great difficulty, I hasten to add, slid him onto the stretcher, and then we maneuvered him over to the window. Now, the plan was the four of us would lift him, because it was going to take the four of us to lift him at least. There's no way two people could lift this guy. And we would put him on the edge of the window frame, and then we would shuffle that stretcher halfway out, kind of on the tipping point, to the point where the two inside could hold him. At which case, the two on the outside, which in this case was the undertakers, would run around outside the caravan, and they would take the weight from the outside and support him on the balance point, before we would then run around and join them, and then the four of us would be able to load him into the car. But there was still kids everywhere. But we just, they had no choice. We couldn't stay there. I couldn't get rid of the kids. I wasn't going to start calling hundreds of cops to keep these kids back, because all you do is attract more attention and make a bigger fuss. So I said, right, let's just get on with it. Let's just get it done. So we put the sheet across him. The window hinges get taken off, so the window's taken out. So now this big window, or this big space where the window was, is there, and we're pretty confident he's going to fit out of there, although only just again. So we lift him with much sort of grunting and straining, lift him, and we get him exactly as we wanted, halfway onto. We've now got a crowd of 20 or 30 kids standing outside, wide-eyed, kind of not really sure what they're looking at. Lift him onto the balance point. The two undertakers let go, and me and the other copper holding him on the inside while they run to the outside to get him. They must have got to about the door of the caravan to then exit and head round to help, when the underneath of the window ledge, so part of the actual caravan, made this horrendous cracking noise and basically broke and completely collapsed. So where he was neatly balancing relatively level with us holding the inside, all it did was collapse underneath him and drop one end of the trolley, or sorry, the stretcher, enough for him to spill out off of it onto the floor and land in a big crumpled heap at the base of the caravan window, and obviously uncovered himself in the process, to my horror and the horror and gasps of all the collective children that are now staring at this, this scene from a movie, with this poor massive dead guy, crumpled in a big heap. It was just horrendous. And you look back now and you can chuckle, but at the time it was not a laughing matter, and dignified it wasn't, but it obviously wasn't intentional. So we quickly run round as well. We chuck the stretcher out the window. We run round with the undertakers. We're trying to convince the kids, right, kids, just go away now. Of course, they're not going anywhere. We have to roll this guy back onto the stretcher, quickly get him covered up, and then open up the back of this Volvo estate and slide him in. Now they've got the back seats down, so it's got the length. But we slide him in, and we get him 3/4 of the way where into the car, where he's now the top of his belly is basically stuck on the top of the car, because he's so high, even laying on his back because he's so big, that it looked like he wasn't going to fit in the car. So I was like, this is exactly what I didn't want. This is why I said measure him, and it was all getting a bit stressful. But anyway, in the end, nightmarishly, we basically had to kind of push down on his stomach and kind of wobble him about and push on his stomach and push and kind of grunt and groan. I mean, honestly, it just looked horrendous, to eventually get him in this car. Now, as soon as we loaded him in this car, the back of the suspension kind of, groaned under the strain and was, as it kind of, leant right down, almost touching the floor. It now had virtually no ground clearance. Now, this Volvo had a tow bar on it. And eventually we got the door closed and the undertakers drove off. And as they drove across the grass to get to the road, the tow bar was ploughing a furrow in the grass across this caravan site. And running behind it, they were now the Pied Piper, was all these kids shouting and screaming, oh my God, there's a dead body in there, I've seen it, and all this. I mean, absolute nightmare. And sure enough, when they got on the tarmac, they had just enough ground clearance to keep going. And off they went into the sunset, leaving us with this place, and quite frankly, wondering, just what had happened. Now, you got two choices at this point. You either go back to the Nick and kind of, resign, or you ultimately have to kind of laugh it off, have a cup of tea, because obviously we're British and that's what we do, and put it down to experience, and what an experience it was. Wow. So, yes, another death story. Sort of funny, obviously not for the poor dead guy, but yeah, just one of those things again that you see in a career in the police, and one of the stranger ones. So there we go. Hope it was enjoyable. Is probably the wrong word, but perhaps interesting again. And you'll have to kind of picture that scene for yourself. Thanks very much for listening. Police Stories Podcast. That's me done again, and I'll speak to you soon. Take it easy. Bye.